Backyards are supposed to feel private, a space just outside your home. But once it gets dark, small sounds carry further, and shapes don't always look the way they should. In this video, you'll hear 3 scary horror stories that happened in backyards, moments that started just steps away from home, and slowly turned into something far more unsettling. If you enjoy horror stories like this, like the video and subscribe. And if you want to support the channel even more, super thanks are always appreciated.
I live in a semi-rural part of Oregon, in a house positioned on about 3 acres of land. The layout of the property is fairly straightforward. The front acre is mostly driveway and a manicured lawn facing a quiet 2-lane county road. The house sits right in the middle. The back 2 acres transition from short grass into a thick, untamed patch of pine woods. When my wife and I bought the place 4 years ago, the appeal was the isolation. We wanted space and we wanted quiet. For the first 2 years, that is exactly what we got. During our 3rd spring in the house, I decided to put in a substantial vegetable garden. I tilled a large rectangular section of the backyard, about 50 feet from the back deck, right where the grass starts to give way to the tree line. I planted tomatoes, bell peppers, zucchini, and leafy greens. I even put up a basic wire fence, about 3 feet high, to keep out the local rabbits. The garden was doing incredibly well until mid-July. That is when I started waking up to find the beds disturbed. It was not a subtle disruption. Entire tomato plants were ripped out by the roots and left lying in the dirt. The wire fencing was bent inward in several places, as if something heavy had climbed over it or leaned heavily against it. I initially assumed we were dealing with a persistent raccoon, or maybe a deer that had figured out how to clear the low barrier. I spent a Saturday repairing the fence and replanting what I could salvage, only to find the exact same destruction 3 days later. Frustrated, I decided to figure out exactly what kind of animal I was dealing with. I drove to a local sporting goods store and purchased a standard battery-operated trail camera. It was a dark green model, equipped with motion sensors and infrared for night vision. It recorded photos onto a standard SD card. When I got home, I found a sturdy oak tree about 15 feet away from the edge of the garden. I strapped the camera to the trunk, positioning it about 4 feet off the ground. I angled the lens so it had a wide, clear view of the entire garden enclosure, turned the power switch on, and left it alone. I decided to let it run for a full week to ensure I captured whatever was visiting my property. The following Saturday morning, the weather was overcast and cool. I walked out to the oak tree, unclipped the heavy plastic housing of the camera, and removed the SD card. I brought it inside, poured a cup of coffee, and sat down at my kitchen island. I slid the card into the reader on my laptop and opened the file folder. There were 72 photos in total. The first 20 or so were exactly what I expected. They were blank shots, triggered by the wind moving the heavy branches of a nearby shrub, or low-quality nighttime images of a fox cutting across the edge of the frame. The timestamps indicated these were mostly taken in the early evening. Around photo number 25, the subject matter changed completely. The timestamp read 2:15 a.m. It was a Tuesday. The infrared camera had captured a man standing right next to the garden fence. He was wearing dark, loose-fitting clothing and a worn baseball cap pulled low over his forehead. Because of the infrared flash, his eyes reflected the light, giving him a pale, washed-out appearance. He was not looking at the garden. He was not touching the fence. He was standing completely still, his body angled away from the camera, looking directly at the back of my house. Specifically, he was facing the sliding glass doors that lead into my living room. I set my coffee mug down. I clicked to the next photo. It was taken the following night, Wednesday at 3:10 a.m. The exact same man was in the frame. This time he was standing a few feet closer to the camera. His posture was identical. He was just standing in the dark, staring at the house. This pattern continued. I clicked through file after file. Thursday night at 2:45 a.m. Friday morning at 4 a.m. Every single night that week, the camera caught him standing in my yard. He never carried a flashlight. He never appeared to hold any tools or weapons. He just stood there, observing the house in the dead of night. A deep, unsettling dread began to settle in my stomach, but I kept clicking through the files. I needed to see all of them. I finally reached the photos taken the previous afternoon, Friday. I had finished work early that day and decided to do some yard work before the weekend. The photo on my screen showed me. I was standing with my back to the camera, wearing a white t-shirt, pulling weeds near the corner of the garden fence. The timestamp in the bottom right corner read 4:30 p.m. I clicked to the next photo. The timestamp read 4:31 p.m. I was still in the frame, bent over the wooden edge of the garden bed. Standing roughly 10 feet behind me, half concealed by the thick trunk of the oak tree where the camera was mounted, was the man. He was out there with me in broad daylight. The angle of the camera and the width of the tree trunk meant he was positioned entirely in my blind spot. If I had turned my head just a fraction of an inch to the right, I would have seen him. I clicked the next photo. Timestamp 4:32 p.m. I was standing up in the frame, stretching my lower back, looking toward the house. The man was gone. He had approached me, stood within arm's reach while I was completely unaware, and then retreated seamlessly into the tree line without snapping a twig or making a single sound. I did not hesitate. I closed the laptop, locked the front and back doors, and called the county sheriff's department. 2 deputies arrived within 20 minutes. I showed them the footage. They took the SD card as evidence and spent an hour walking the perimeter of my property, pushing deep into the woods. They found trampled brush and a few scuff marks in the dirt, but no sign of the man. They increased patrols along the county road for the next month, but the motion alerts on my new security system never triggered. The realization that someone possessed the skill and the desire to stand that close to me without making their presence known fundamentally changed how I exist in my own home. I no longer go into my backyard without a clear line of sight to the woods. The garden has completely overgrown. I refuse to maintain it.
My house is located in a typical, densely packed suburban development in central Ohio. The neighborhood was built in the late 90s, meaning the properties are relatively close together, separated by standard 6-foot wooden privacy fences. You can usually hear your neighbors mowing their lawns or talking on their patios. It is the kind of environment where you feel secure simply because there are so many people around. Last spring was exceptionally wet. We had weeks of heavy, unrelenting rain. Because my property sits at a slight downward angle compared to the house behind me, I noticed water pooling heavily in the back right corner of my yard. It was turning the grass into a muddy swamp and threatening to rot the wooden foundation of my storage shed. Contractors were quoting ridiculous prices for landscaping work, so I decided to spend a weekend digging a French drain myself. The plan was simple: dig a trench about 18 inches deep and 20 feet long, running parallel to the back fence line, drop in some perforated PVC pipe, and cover it with gravel to divert the water toward the street. I started early on a Saturday morning. The ground was saturated, making the dirt heavy and difficult to move. I was about halfway through the project, covered in mud and sweating through my shirt, when my shovel struck something hard. It did not feel like a rock or a root. It made a distinct, hollow plastic sound. I dropped the shovel and knelt in the mud. I used my hands to clear the wet soil away from the object. It was a heavy-duty, black Pelican case, the kind used to transport expensive camera equipment or firearms. It was roughly the size of a large shoebox. My first thought was that a previous owner had buried a time capsule, or perhaps hidden some valuables. I pulled the case out of the hole and carried it over to my patio table. I grabbed a hose and washed the heavy mud off the exterior. The plastic was barely scratched. The heavy metal latches were stiff, but clean underneath the dirt. This was not an old, forgotten item. It had been buried recently, and it was entirely waterproof. Curiosity overrode my exhaustion. I popped the two front latches. They opened with a loud snap. I lifted the lid. Inside the case, resting on custom-cut foam padding, was a large, heavy-duty Ziploc bag. Inside the bag were three items: a standard spiral-bound notebook, a compact digital camera, and a cluster of common house keys on a simple metal ring. I unsealed the bag and pulled out the notebook first. It was a logbook. The pages were filled with neat, block handwriting. The entries detailed specific times, dates, and activities stretching back approximately 6 months. I read the first few lines. Tuesday, 6:15 p.m., arrived home. Ordered takeout, lights out at 11 p.m. I skipped down a few pages. Thursday, 8:30 a.m., left for work. Forgot briefcase, returned at 8:35. Left again. The entries were painfully mundane, but their context was terrifying. It was a meticulous, highly accurate record of my daily schedule. The logs noted when my car was in the driveway, when my lights turned on and off, and when I had visitors. I set the notebook down and picked up the digital camera. I pressed the power button. The screen illuminated, showing the battery was still half full. I pressed the playback button to view the gallery. The first dozen photos were taken from the street. They showed my car parked in the driveway, the front facade of my house, and me walking to my mailbox. They were taken from a distance, likely from inside a parked vehicle, but as I scrolled further back into the memory card, the perspective shifted entirely. The next sequence of photos was taken from inside my house. There were clear, well-lit pictures of my living room layout. There were photos of my kitchen counter, showing my mail sorted into piles. There were photos of my home office, clearly capturing the documents sitting on my desk. Then I saw a photo of my bedroom. The bed was unmade, the sheets pulled back exactly how I leave them when I'm rushing to get ready for work in the mornings. My breathing became shallow. I reached back into the case and picked up the metal ring holding the keys. I walked slowly to my back, sliding glass door. I slid the first brass key into the deadbolt. It slid in smoothly. I turned it. The lock clicked open perfectly. I walked back to the trench I had been digging. I looked at the hole where I found the case, and then I looked at the wooden privacy fence directly above it. The case was buried on my property, but it was positioned right against the wood. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. Whoever buried it did not have to jump the fence. They had simply removed a loose plank from the other side or reached under a gap at the bottom to bury the box on my property. Hiding it here allowed them to retrieve their surveillance logs, the camera, and my spare keys without having to carry incriminating evidence off the property or risk being pulled over with it in their car. I stepped back from the fence and immediately called the police. The responding officers were visibly disturbed. Their investigation determined that the photos inside my house were undoubtedly taken during the day while I was at work. There were no signs of forced entry on any of my doors or windows because the stalker had somehow acquired a copy of my key months ago. They questioned the neighbors behind me, a retired couple who rarely left their house, but found nothing. The police assumed someone was accessing the utility easement behind the fences to monitor the properties. Because the Pelican case and its contents yielded no usable fingerprints, the case was eventually suspended. I had every lock on the house changed that same afternoon and paid a premium for a comprehensive security system with interior cameras. I still live in that house. I still wave to my neighbors. But the quiet safety I once felt in the suburbs is permanently gone.
And that's all for tonight. Remember, the most terrifying monsters are the ones that look just like us. The ones who might even live right next door. If these stories serve as a good reminder to trust your instincts, then show your support and like and subscribe. Hitting that bell means you'll get a warning before the next nightmare begins. Sleep well, if you can.